My name is Kent Bai, and today I'm going to be talking about towards a framework of XR ethics. And so originally it was called XR Ethics Framework, but I think it's more of like we're moving towards this as a journey and a process, and we're not quite there yet. So I'll be talking about some of the things I'm looking for in terms of trying to figure out what patterns are going to be interesting to start to form this framework for XR ethics. So here's the things we're going to be covering. I'm going to talk about my journey into XR ethics and privacy, responsible innovation frameworks, nested context framework, a survey of some of the other XR ethics frameworks, human rights and digital rights frameworks, and then neuro-rights frameworks, and then finally synthesizing all those things together as we're moving towards an XR ethics framework. All right, so where did my journey begin into all of this? So if we go back to the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference 2016, which was, at that point I had recorded about 400 different episodes of the Voices of VR, and I was presenting there my synthesis of what the major themes that I was seeing. And so I presented this human experience of virtual reality, all these different contextual domains. Some of the answers of what is the ultimate potential of VR fit into one of these different dimensions, which roughly translate into different industry verticals. And then leading up to that conference, actually, Upload VR had reported that there was some things that were going on with the Oculus and sending data back and forth. It got the attention of Senator Al Franken, who then asked Oculus what was going on. And so at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference 2016, there was just a lot of buzz about privacy. And then from that point, I've done over 50 different interviews about privacy since May of 2016. There was actually a VR Identity and Privacy Summit that I helped organize in 2018, and we had the ambitions to try to solve privacy in the course of one day. And we had a lot of hubris to then be humbled by that it being a much more difficult problem, which sent me on a journey of then trying to figure out, okay, what needs to be done here? So at the Laval Virtual 2019, we started to brainstorm all these different aspects of these ethical issues. And from that, I used that contextual domain to start to roughly map those out. And then we presented that at Laval Virtual 2019, which was trying to break up all these different ethical issues into these different contextual domains. And then at Augmented World Expo in 2019, I came up here for about an hour describing all the different ethical and moral dilemmas. I'm not going to be doing that today because that talk would take 2 to 3 hours just to even describe all of them. This is more of a high level, trying to understand a sense-making framework to help to organize a lot of these different ethical issues and how to actually approach them. So this is just an example of some of those different ethical domains, and this actually formed the inspiration of a lot of other things, including the XR Ethics Manifesto, which I did in 2019, which then is trying to break down all those individual aspects. And by the way, this presentation, as well as previous presentations, are on my SlideShare at Kent Bai if you want to check them out, to be able to dig into more detail that I have time to even read everything that's on these slides. And you can look at all these different citations on your own time. And then the IEEE came, and through a lot of this work that I was starting, then we created this global initiative on the ethics of extended reality, which I was being an executive member and leading the white paper committee for a while. And then this is actually going to be coming out here soon. We took that ethical framework and started to break it down into these 7 different chapters. And you can think about doing a deep dive into privacy and autonomy and identity and harassment and ethics within education and medical XR, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and different financial aspects. And what I learned from this is that there's a lot of foundational work that still needs to be done just to even synthesize all these different ethical issues bounded to specific ethical domains. And even this effort, there's still a lot more work to be done. And so this is just like the first iteration of that, and it will continue. But as we're thinking about these issues, there's still a need for larger sense-making frameworks to understand where this issue of privacy is going. And I think that's, for me, I learned I was more interested in more of the philosophical aspects to help guide and direct this overall process that needs to happen amongst the larger community. So again, like I said, there's lots of other issues that I had mapped out that aren't even covered in this initial paper because you only have a limited amount of time and energy and with volunteer effort. And so as a community, we need to continue this work to flesh those things out. So I'm going to look at some of the responsible innovation frameworks, which I think is sort of a meta framework that helps to understand how all these things are tying together. So Facebook came forth with their responsible innovation framework, and they announced Project Aria in 2020 at their Facebook Connect at the time when they were still called Facebook. And then Sally Applin and Catherine Flick came out criticizing this as sort of an ethics washing exercise, where they had already decided that this is what they were going to do, and then this is just some veneer of ethics to make it sound like they were actually considering the ethics without really seriously considering some of the ethical issues, including bystander privacy. So this paper really deconstructs that. I had a conversation with them and started digging into these ideas of responsible innovation. Well, what would a robust responsible innovation framework look like? And so there's a Horizon 2020 European Commission on Responsible Research and Innovation. There was different principles of doing the research and innovation, considering all the aspects, doing the stakeholder participation, and then doing some governance and transparency aspects as well. And I think this graphic here, there's a tier of different types of engagement that you can do. And most of the engagement that you see is in the tokenism or in the manipulation, meaning that you'll have Meta say, oh, we've consulted lots of different privacy experts on this, and so we're all good. Well, actually, the privacy experts from like Access Now said, there's actually a lot of problems that you have with this, and so just because they're consulting with these different experts doesn't mean they're actually listening to them. So this is a ladder that shows like what would actual participation look like up to at the highest level of citizen power, citizen control, delegated power, and partnership, none of which any of these companies are actually even seriously considering. So their responsible innovation framework, both Apple and Flick are claiming, is sort of an ethics washing because it's not actually responsible innovation for the best practices for what responsible innovation actually are. There's also this idea that you have different stage-gated phases of innovation that is in a governance model that you can think of as kind of like a metaphoric big red button saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't launch this because there's too many ethical issues. That doesn't seem to be what's happening. It seems to be like there's a schedule for when things are going to come out, and we're going to launch it regardless of whatever ethical issues are coming up, and it just goes forward without really having any serious ability of doing this type of stage-gated innovation governance model that is described in a book cited here in Owen et al. From 2013. And then there's this responsible innovation book that dives into different frameworks. This framework is actually adapted by the UK's Engineering and Physical Science Research Council into these 4 major stages, which is anticipate, reflect, engage, and act. And when I see these, I want to be able to spatialize it and really understand it. And so I found this that shows it as this loop between anticipating what the problems could be, you're reflecting on those issues, and then you're having this reflective analysis, you're engaging with the public and getting interviews and really asking and doing this active inquiry, and then you're having some sort of responsible action that is coming from that. So you see this loop of anticipate, reflect, engage, and act, which I think is actually providing a really good framework as a meta framework for ethics. And then from there, then we can start to slot in what are the other specifics from that. Okay, so design thinking is another big thing in terms of what is it that you're creating and why, and so there's a lot of best practices of design thinking that already has those loops that are built in, engaging with different audiences, and so design concepts need to be integrated in an iterative fashion, so rather than thinking as these things as static things like we were talking about earlier in this previous session that you put a PDF on, but this is an active process that is in constant iteration and constant evolution. And I think that's a challenge, is that you want to be able to be as inclusive of all the different ethical issues, but you have limited time and energy, and so how do you decide what you're really focusing on, what you're prioritizing? And so, there's this E3XR framework that came out recently and is a ethical, educational, and eudaimonic XR design. Now, they address this issue of not being able to handle everything by breaking it into a foundations of ethics, and then they have the education, and then they have the eudaimonia at the top, which is a lot of the issues of flourishing. But my concern about this is that you start to create these bifurcations that you kind of very easy to fall into utilitarianism, which is that you're trying to prioritize the biggest groups, and it's those that are the most marginalized that end up having the most suffering. So a lot of things that they're putting in here in terms of accessibility, equity, empathy, inclusion, that's actually, I would say maybe needs to be prioritized at the bottom. But I think this idea that you have different levels makes sense in the sense that anything you're creating, you can't do everything at once. And so you have to make some decision as to what is going to be your baseline and what is going to be sort of a nice to have flourishing. But trying to balance those things out so you don't fall into the trappings of utilitarianism, which is that the people who are the most marginalized continue to be even more marginalized at an amplified fashion. So I think one of the ideas here is to combine all these different things of thinking about the iterative process and the design thinking, and you're trying to chip away at these different issues, but figure out for whatever your context is, that's the other issue with this E3XR framework, is that it's going to be very context dependent for what is that baseline of ethics and what's the eudaimonia, or depending on whatever you're creating, are going to break that up based upon your audience and your resources and everything else. So again, going back to this as a loop and a framework, you have the anticipate, reflect, engage, and act, which I think is sort of a meta understanding for what we're trying to get at when we think about ethics within XR. So again, I refer you to go look at Apple and Flick's, Facebook's Project Aria indicates problems for responsible innovation, making the claim of this sort of ethics washing. And there's a lot of really great resources for responsible innovation that are listed in here that I highly recommend you go check out and read more information about some of the best practices for responsible innovation rather than listening to what Meta has to say about what they're doing, because what they're doing is actually not the industry standard for what responsible innovation actually means outside of the context of what they're doing. All right, so this nested context framework is This idea that, Lawrence Lessig has the cultural norms, the laws, the market, technology, architecture, and code. And these are dials that you turn in order to control complicated issues. Any sufficiently complicated ethical issue will be a combination of some of these things, and you have to figure out how to match all these different elements. For me, I like to think it as this mereological nested context. Mereology is what Alfred North Whitehead came up in this process philosophy, which is the idea that you have these wholes and parts that are on top of each other. So at the largest context, you have the earth and the world, and then from there you have the people and the culture, and then you have the laws, and then you have the economy, then you have the design guidelines, technology and architecture, hardware, operating system code, app code, then you have user experience, and that you have this as a way of any issue is going to be some combination of these. And so just to flesh that out a little bit, you have human rights principles that are feeding into the laws, you have the ethical design principles that are informing both the companies and the laws, and you have the third-party app experience developers and the users. And so this, as just an example for privacy, you could start to break down how all this starts to play out and see that even though there's these design principles, there's still all of the different privacies within the context of these companies having you sign these adhesion contracts, which then gives your quote-unquote informed consent, which many have argued that's not actually informed consent, but it's basically a loophole for being able to have them do whatever they want because they have your consent. And everything is based upon user consent, and so if they get that, then that negates all these other issues, which is a need for having larger human rights principles. That means that you may or may not be able to give over aspects of your neuro-rights that should not be something that's left up to the consent. Meta likes to really focus on control and user control, but there's actually some of these neuro-rights that we need laws to address some of these different issues. All right, there's other issues that we can dive into, and this is just an example of the harassment, and I'm not going to dive into it here, but it's something that is in the IEEE paper. There's other ways of looking at different issues of harassment and all the different relational dynamics. And so this is a process for each of these issues of trying to break down into these maps to understand what can you solve by culture, what can you solve by technological architecture, and what can you solve by needing to have laws passed to be able to address some of these issues. So that's the nested context. All right, now some quick survey of other XR ethical frameworks. We talked about the E3XR, which splits into these different levels of ethics, education, eudaimonia, and how they break it up. Again, this is going to be very contextually dependent for whatever you're doing. Action pedagogy for immersive learning. You have the augmented learning analytics framework, which I want to point out here has a lot of aspects of the different stakeholders of technology and the different people. And so a big part of ethical mapping is knowing who the stakeholders are and how they're related to the technology, how the technology is related to these larger intentions of the context you're working in this case, education. Helen Niesepom's contextual integrity theory is really important in terms of setting these different contextual dimensions of privacy. And again, a lot of my work that I've been done previously is trying to map out all these different contextual domains, and there's lots of different issues on each of those contextual domains. Then the XR Safety Initiative has a framework for XR risk assessment, and each of these, the human, societal, information, financial, legal, each of those are also contextual domains, and they're just breaking it down and looking at each of the different risks associated for that. We just saw a little bit of the anatomy of the metaverse, which was first presented at the Simulation Interoperability Standards Organization Symposium. The critique I would have about this is that sometimes there's different aspects of the mereological nested aspects of culture and technology and really trying to sort out what's what. I think for me, as I start to look at this, I look at things like Simon Wardley's Wardley mapping, which tries to give a value chain mapping of all these different systems and the different phases of evolution that they're in. And I think we need to do that as an XR industry to be able to understand how does 5G, how does IoT, how do these other things fit into this larger ecosystem for what is evolving into the metaverse, and how to make sense of that, and where are the parts we really need to consider some of the different ethical concerns. And this is just an example for educational context, how there's different phases of open source projects into commercial off-the-shelf projects, things that you have to do hand-rolled, and then a value chain on that. So that, I think, will help inform, as we're thinking about constructing these systems, at what phase of evolution and what potential other ethical concerns start to get introduced there. Tony Parisi has his 7 rules in the metaverse, which goes through and lists all these different rules, which is a guiding ethical principles for what the metaverse may turn into. We have Christopher Lafayette has the 7 standards of the metaverse, which I'd say is really trying to add these different elements of human rights into these principles, and so that we don't just focus on the technological specifications, but we're also trying to look at these higher order human rights aspects. Protopian Futures Framework from Monica Bilaskita and all their other collaborators, really trying to look at this sort of intersectional approach of looking at the most marginalized communities and trying to emphasize different aspects of plurality and community and regenerative action, being connected to the earth. And so I just published a 3-hour conversation with her, really diving into her ethical approach of world growing rather than just world building. And then there's the intersectional feminist perspective of these different axes of power and privilege and domination and oppression, and recognizing the thing I was talking about earlier, the utilitarian approach. If you're just going for the biggest market, sometimes you may actually be causing the most harm by the people who are on these marginalized and oppressed communities, and really, in some ways, prioritizing what they have to say, because they're often the early warning system for when there's gaps in your ethical systems. And so you really need to be as inclusive and diverse as you can in order to progress with whatever system you end up adopting. So just quickly, some of the other aspects of human rights and digital rights. RightsCon this year, I was participating in the Electronic Frontier Foundation, talking about different human rights frameworks, and there's a discussion. At the time, Facebook, now Meta, came up with a whole series of responsible innovation dimensions, which is their contextual approach. I was really hoping they were going to talk about that at Connect 2021, but they didn't. They reverted back to their principles, which are not really robust. This is a more robust system, and I hope to hear more about what they plan on this, of how they do these various different trade-offs against all these different things. Obviously, they're really going through it for not really doing that very well, so we have to really figure out how to prevent that from happening next time. You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is like the foundation for any sort of ethical framework. You need to have that included. There's also the UN Sustainable Development Goals that are there. And so I just took a rough cut at trying to map all these different contextual domains to see where there's things around identity, where there's things around your economic aspects and education and medical aspects and communal aspects. So I think this is a larger project, though, as we start to look at these existing human rights frameworks and start to distill those down into frameworks for digital rights and neuro-rights, which is something that has been happening with the 10 internet rights and principles, which is looking at these 10 different principles. So trying to integrate those different principles in. Barcelona had the Charter of Digital Rights, which had all these different rights that they were passing as a city. And then the government of Spain actually passed a Charter of Digital Rights on July 14th, 2021, which has all these different digital rights that are embedded at the government level. And then finally, the last two parts here, the neuro-rights frameworks. You have the non-invasive neuro interfaces that happened on May 26, 2021. Rafael Yusta from the Columbia Neuro-Rights Initiative was a part of that, and he had been a part of the Morningstar Group, which recently published their neuro-rights, which is the right to identity, right to agency, right to mental privacy, a right to fair access to mental augmentation, and the right to be free from algorithmic bias. Now, the thing to note about this is that the right to identity, the right to agency, the right to mental privacy, these are the things that are most at threat. So these are the human rights frameworks saying that with these companies that are gathering all this data, they're creating a digital twin, they're understanding you more than you understand yourself, that's your identity, you own that. That shouldn't be something that's a settler colonial mindset that they're seizing and controlling. And they're also, with that, particularly mapping and being able to nudge your behaviors, that means that you're losing your access of your agency and your control. So because of that, we need to have our right to agency and right to autonomy, and also our right to mental privacy, so all this information is going to be able to distill what we're actually thinking about. The neuro-rights is actually embedded into Chile's constitution. And then you have the neuro-rights ethicist towards a governance framework for brain data, trying to bring other different contextual domains. And this is a paper that they recently published that goes into that a little bit more. Just a quick word about some of the neurotechnologies that we have, like Project Galea. They have all these different aspects of these EOG, EEG, EMG, EDA, temperature, and all these things that we're feeding in there. And so there's a whole wide list of biometric and physiological data that is eventually going to be fed into these XR technologies. And so how do we start to make sense of this? And so there's a taxonomy of brain data that those neuro-rights activists were starting to put together. There's contextual data, these direct and indirect measures of our neural functions, and biometric psychography by Britton Heller is a big concept that needs to be integrated in. Then we have identity versus biometric psychography. A lot of the different aspects of privacy is really focused on your identity as an individual, but we're moving into this realm of really focusing on biometric psychography, the contextually relevant information that you're radiating off, and they're building up these models of your behaviors over time to be able to understand who you are. And so biometric psychography is not a term that's defined in the law yet, and it needs to be in order to really move forward into protecting our neuro rights. And so there's also behaviors, our intentions, our actions, our movements, our mental thoughts, cognitive processes, our cognitive load, social presence, affective states, emotional sentiment, facial expressions, microexpressions, our stress, our arousal, physiological reactions, eye gaze, attention, body language, and muscle fatigue. As I start to try to categorize all the different types of neurodata so we understand what it's giving us for the experience, but also what the risks are from an ethical perspective. And again, we go back to this map of trying to map out these different issues, and the real leveraged point is that we may need a new federal privacy law to really address a lot of these issues. And again, the neuro rights need to be a part of that. So as I start to wrap up here and just say, like, overall, we have all those different frameworks, how do we tie all those things together? What I would say is that this anticipate, reflect, engage, and act is a really good meta framework to start to slot those in. So you have the anticipate. So being able to understand the whole landscape of all those different issues and what your context is and what you need to be paying attention to. From there, looking at the neurological nested context of what dimensions are part of the culture, what's the laws, what are the economic aspects, what are the things that could be architected from a technology perspective, and then fitting into that these different mappings of how all those things fit together. And then you have different accesses of privilege, domination, oppression that you really need to take an intersectional, inclusive, and a diverse approach of really engaging with lots of different people. And again, the IEEE is going to be doing a deep dive into some of these different contextual domains to help map out what you should anticipate for each of these specific contexts, but there's much more work to be done there. Reflect is a lot about this design thinking and being intentional about what you're doing and why, and then understanding how that fits in, but also using design thinking practices. And then in the engage, that's the big part where you really actually engage with the community in a way that gives them power and control and partnership, and not just this tokenized or manipulative way of saying that you're doing engagement when you're really not. And the Protopia feature is a real intersectional approach. Highly recommend taking a look at this as a way of taking in all these different perspectives. And then finally, the action, that is where you actually are building. And the process of building is your own process of trying to prioritize what are the baseline ethical issues that you're going to address with the resources you have, whatever context you have, and then try to look at the more flourishing aspects, but more things that you're adding over time to be as inclusive as you can as you do more research to making things free from algorithmic bias or whatever that is. It takes time and energy to do that. And this iterative process that is never ending, and you're just continuing to do that. And again, doing a stage-gated innovation. So you're not just like setting a deadline for when this comes out and there's no way to tack on ethics on the end, but to really give real power to making sure if there's any big ethical concerns, maybe you push that big red button and you don't launch it yet. So again, this privacy issue is a big issue that's still a lot of work to be done. Neuro-rights, lots of work that's happening there with different ways of mapping all these out into these human rights into different domains. And then neuroethicists, I highly recommend checking out Towards a Governance Framework Towards Brain Data to start to do that. So there's a lot of work there. So yeah, that's sort of a summary of this towards framework for XR ethics, and that we're just at the very beginning of this journey, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and a lot of work where other people in the audience could be involved with that. So with that, I think we have time for maybe one question or so.
Wow. Give him a second to drink a little water, everyone. But no, please, if you have questions, we have a couple of microphones here, or if you're passionate and boisterous, yell it out.
Thanks, Ken. I think I have to rewatch your presentation at half speed. It's a gold mine, and I'm working in academia. I'm a marketing professor. I always thought there must be like some form of more research on this end. As I kind of prepare my thoughts on that, this is either like an impossible to answer question or a very, very dumb question. I'm probably thinking the latter. What's the 1, 2, 3 key differentiators in your mind when you compare like the ethics we need for XR or the metaverse versus like the ethics we have in the real world, right? Because there's a lot of published on real world ethics. What's the key differentiator between those?
The biggest difference is a lot of ethics from the Western philosophy is based in substance metaphysics. So it sees things as these static objects that are properties on top of each other. And I guess the thing that I'm advocating is a shift towards process relational metaphysics, which is more relational and more iterative. So a lot of the graphs, you see these pyramids, and they seem to be very static, and you just achieve this utopic vision of you're now ethical, but that's never the case. It's always a journey and a process. Then it becomes an issue with your limited time and resources. How do you start to break that up in a way that you're looking and evaluating what those harms are, and then trying to incrementally progress so that you're putting stuff out in the world, but a lot of times it means putting stuff into the world and listening and then adapting. So I don't think a lot of the existing ethical frameworks really take that kind of iterative approach because it's really rooted in substance metaphysics, meaning they think of these things as these static objects. And I think there's a part of which the synthesis of XR actually needs to integrate a lot of those existing ethical frameworks, whether it's eudaimonia or deontology or different aspects of utilitarianism. I mean, all of them are still going to be valid, and each of those are lenses that are prioritizing different things. And I think what we need for both the technology ethics and XR ethics is a synthesis. Just as XR is synthesizing all different aspects of design from like architecture and web design and computer-human interaction and cinematic storytelling and game design, we need a similar type of synthesis for these ethical frameworks. And I think that the responsible innovation principles are a good meta framework. Like as long as you have those process where you're engaging with people, and it's more of like the difference between building a building versus doing a game design where you have to constantly do playtesting. And that's part of the reason why our ethical issues and policy issues are so far behind, is because there's a technology pacing gap that moves much quicker than our conceptual frameworks that are able to really adapt it. So I think taking a more iterative approach and yeah, just trying to synthesize a lot of these different approaches based upon the context that you're in. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Although we are out of time, we have to wrap here on this one, but thank you so much, Ken. Round of applause. As a reminder, all of these are being recorded. They're available to any attendee or virtual attendee. So I think you're going to want to rewatch this one. Maybe at half speed. Thanks, everybody. We have a coffee break right now.